Hello guys, we are on the new concept of pawn chains, and this comes under the pawn structures, and I'm going to show you some of classical games on this concept. The first game is French defense advanced variation. Let's see the game. e4, e6, d4 and d5, and now e5 the advanced variation, and c5 and c3, knight c6, knight f3, queen b6. Now bishop to d3. This move was popular even in the 19th century. In the second half of the 20th century, it was played with a completely different idea behind it. Uh, Now next c takes d4, c takes d4 and bishop d7 and bishop e2. Of course, this move is not recommended. White just loses an important tempo. However, authorities back then considered the elimination of central tension as a benefit to white, even worth the tempo. Here, castles, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, and queen takes d4. Now, knight to c3 was a largely tested gambit in the 20th century. However, in our computer era, it is considered as a quite harmless. This is the reason why white's sixth move is not very popular. And now a6 was shown to be the simplest way of parrying white's initiative. After bishop e2, here even bishop c2, knight b4, with the idea of bishop b5 with an initiative for black on the queen side. Now knight after bishop e2, then knight ge7. Now b3. Here actually knight a3, knight a3 and knight f5, and knight c2 is another way to protect the d4 pawn. And here instead of knight f5, knight g6, short castles, bishop e7 with f6 coming soon is also good for black. White plays b3 here, then knight f5, then bishop to b2, then bishop b4 check and king f1. King f1, then bishop to e7. Tarrasch's biggest opponent, Nimzowitsch, later suggested the amazing and beautiful line, that is castles. Now g4, knight h6, rook g1, f6, then ef6, then rook f6, and after g5, rook takes f3, bishop takes f3, knight f5. Black is clearly dominating. Actually, black can go for this even with the bishop still on c8, if white doesn't lose a tempo with a slight squared bishop. Black has solid compensation for the lost material. and but here black goes bishop e7, then white plays g3. White patiently regroups. The idea behind Tarrasch last move is that uh, if white plays g4, black could play knight h4. Black exchanges his knight, which was attacking d4, for a piece which was defending it. Meanwhile, white's king becomes vulnerable, and black would organize an attack down the f file. So here so white goes g3, and here the players are, the white player is Paulsen and black player is Tarrasch, and it is played in 1888, guys. It is played in the 19th century. Now a5, a very interesting move. Before white activates his pieces, black goes for queenside action. a4, white decides to block the pawn, a matter of style. Now rook c8, bishop to b5. Here king g2 was more natural, and knight a3 controlling b5 and c2 squares was also interesting. After bishop b5, now knight b4. There was no need for this. Black's king will be safe in the center, and it is logical to use the weak b4 square. However, it was more natural to try and exploit white's passivity. Here, instead, castling followed by f6 would be more unpleasant for white. Bishop takes d7. This move is a mistake because it helps black finish his development. But later Nimzowitsch suggested correctly that here knight c3, bishop takes b5 and knight takes b5 as better. And now a big mistake would be knight c2. Now rook to c1, knight ce3 check, f takes e3, knight takes e3 check, king to e2, knight takes d1. Now rook takes c8 check, and after king d7 and rook takes h8, after knight takes b2. Now rook c1. This would be better for white. So knight c2 is a big mistake, it is a blunder. So then here white played bishop takes d7 actually in the game, and after king takes d7, then knight c3, knight c6. Here even there is nothing wrong with rook c6 and queen, and if queen to a6 check, king g2, then queen d3 was another good idea. Here after the check, knight b5, then knight c2 is correct. And after knight c3, knight c6, black plays knight c6, then white plays knight b5, then knight a7, knight takes a7. Here queen d3, knight takes b5, a takes b5 was also possible. After knight takes a7, queen takes a7, queen d3, and that was white's idea. By exchanging the knight, he hopes to cover the weak light square with his queen and to consolidate the position. After king g2 and rook h to c1. Black has an important resource here, but his next move probably shocked Paulson, the white player. Queen to a6. This is an excellent move. White must capture the queen, otherwise black's rook penetrates on c2. White cannot benefit from the doubled a pawns. This is actually good for black. He has even opened the b file. Queen takes a6, b takes a6, king g2, rook c2, bishop c1, rook b8. Everything is going smoothly. For a long time, white will not even be able to try for activity on the king side. He is being completely outplayed. Now rook b1, rook c3, bishop d2, rook c takes b3, rook takes b3, and bishop takes. After rook takes b3, now bishop takes a5. Of course, black has done a good job. White has maintained material balance, but his position is hopeless. Now rook b2. Rook b2. Here even bishop to b4 was even better. After rook b2, then bishop to d2, bishop b4. Here instead, if rook to c1, then knight e3 check, king to g1, then knight c4 is coming. After bishop d2, bishop b4, bishop to f4, black has achieved a lot. Collecting some material on the queen side is only a matter of time. Seeing perfectly well that white is hopeless, black goes for the well-known principle. Don't rush. With his next move, he eliminates white's active intentions on the king side forever. That is h6. Now g4, knight e7. The knight heads to another good square, that is c6. Rook a1, knight c6, bishop c1, rook c2, bishop a3. Avoiding this exchange earlier, white now offers it himself. Another proof that his position is hopeless. Black could take, but prefers to build pressure on the d4 pawn. Now rook to c4, bishop b2, bishop c3, bishop takes c3, rook takes c3. Now rook to b1, king c7, g5. This is a desperate attempt at counterplay anywhere. black naturally ignores the king side. Now rook c4, gh6, gh6 and a5. Now rook to a4. Here knight takes a5, rook a1, king b6, rook b1 check, king a7 forces the king to be passive. So black played rook a4. Now king g3, rook takes a5, king g4, rook a3. The king is stopped. The threat now is rook d3 and rook to d1 and then rook b3. Here a5 immediately was also good. Now h4, knight e7, knight e1 and knight f5. The knight has returned to its best spot. It is stable on f5, attacking two pawns and protecting a weak one. Can we expect any more from a single knight? Knight d3, a5, knight c5, rook c3, rook b1. Here if rook a1, then knight takes d4 and rook takes a5, knight c6, rook b5 and knight takes e5. So rook b1, now knight takes d4, now knight a6 check. Black is completely winning and white tries his last trick. Now king d8. However, black is vigilant. The game is over. Here king c6 would be a mistake. After knight b8 check, king c5. Now knight to d7 and king c4, knight b6, king d3, rook to d1, king e4, rook e1 check. The game is drawn due to perpetual check. After king d8, now rook b8 check, rook c8, rook b7, king e8 and knight c7 check, king f8, knight b5, knight takes b5. Here if rook a7, then knight c6, rook b7, knight takes e5 is coming. After knight b5, knight takes b5, rook takes b5, rook a8, f4, a4, rook b1, a3, f5, a2, rook a1, rook a4, king h5, king g7, fe6, fe6, rook g1 check, king h8, rook a1, king h7, rook g1, pawn queens and rook g7 check, king h8. Why can't this be take? If it is taken, then if it is taken, oh, that's a stalemate, huh? Okay, guys, be careful with this. If the rook is taken, it is a stalemate. The king cannot move anywhere. There are no legal moves for the white. So it was correct to ignore the. Again, even he may come here. Now you must not take it. You have to go on this, and here white resigned. This is a historical clash which made an enormous contribution to the entire advanced variation of the French. This game was the basis of a very detailed and complex part of Nimzovich's work. Okay guys, I hope you would have enjoyed the game and learned as well. I'll be meeting you in the next game. Thank you all.